Hello, and welcome to you all from around the world for this conference of the International Schiller Institute, The World on the Brink for a New Treaty of Westphalia. This is a two-day conference, and we are beginning today's panel one, Europe after the European elections. In order to introduce today's panel and today's conference, I want to refer to some remarks made recently by Vladimir Putin at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. And this was during a question and answer session following the plenary session of that conference. President Putin began to discuss the death of the Bretton Woods monetary system, the system that had existed from the end of the Second World War, established at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, through 1971, August. President Putin referred to the date of January 1976 and the Jamaica Accords Conference, which revised certain laws of the International Monetary Fund to officially end that Bretton Woods system. And that was a system that it used the dollar backed by a fixed parity with gold as the basis of world credit. President Putin then described the unpayable debt, the present unpayable debt of that system, and we're going to hear plenty about that during the course of the conference. But then President Putin, in discussing steps that must be and are now being taken among the nations of the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and the BRICS Plus nations, now including a potential 59 other nations, to avoid being swept away in the avalanche of financial speculation and unpayable indebtedness of the Anglosphere, began to speak about a new possible world order. Now, that is something that would have been the basis for a real discussion and at least provisional agreement in certain respects with earlier American presidents like Franklin Roosevelt, a post-Cuban Missile Crisis John Kennedy, perhaps even with President Ronald Reagan. But that is not the case today. Many have asked the question, why do we need, as Helga Zepp-LaRouche has stated, a new international security and development architecture? Have we actually seen, or are we now living through, the death of the earlier structure? The late economist and statesman Alain LaRouche, who was a co-founder of this organization, made some remarks which we will include here today. He made these remarks actually in 2005 at a conference of the Schiller Institute back then in February, but it may help as a form of commentary on what President Putin was saying about the Bretton Woods system to hear Alain LaRouche describe how he saw the destruction, the erosion, the decline and fall of American leadership from 1971 through that period of 2005, and what he forecast at that time would be the fate of the United States if it did not change course.
So then we got August 1971. Schultz of the Chicago School. We got the Azores Conference, the floating exchange rate system, directed by Schultz, Kissinger's boss, and the tyrant who moved on to install the fascist dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet in Chile, and whose efforts sponsored the unleashing of a Nazi-based mass murder movement throughout the southern cone of South America, Operation Condor. Then we got Brzezinski, who is different, but in a very queer way. And Brzezinski proceeded to destroy the physical economy of the United States by things such as deregulation, and by bringing in his crony Paul Volcker, also a crony of Schultz, to destroy the U.S. banking system. We went on and on and on. And the changes that prevailed, with the exception of our intervention on the SDI, The changes which prevailed took us down the road worse and worse and worse. Under politicians who were not bad, but who went along. And therefore, by going along, they fostered the degeneration of the United States. And it went on and on and on through 2000. The shock came with the certification of the election of George W. Bush. And there was a trickle of resistance, largely from the civil rights faction inside the Congressional caucus, but not much more. And then we came along through the war in the Middle East, the terror, and the looming sense that the system is coming down. And it is coming down. It's coming down now. Nothing can save this system, this world system, this United States system in its present form. The date of death of that system is not yet written, but the inevitability of it is. If we as a people, the United States, do not change, and there is a movement for change, this nation is finished with most of the people in it.
3 days ago, in Washington, D.C., at the National Press Club, the Schiller Institute hosted a press availability which featured Scott Ritter, former United Nations weapons inspector, Colonel Larry Wilkerson, former assistant to chief of staff to Colin Powell, and Colonel Richard Black, a decorated Vietnam War veteran, former Virginia State Senator, and Helga Zepp-LaRouche. And at that time, and that press availability, the danger of thermonuclear war posed by this collapse of American leadership was made very, very clear to the whole world. Today, as we begin today's conference, Panel 1, Europe after the European elections, it's my honor to introduce the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute, Helga Zepp-LaRouche. Welcome, Helga.
Well, hello, dear excellencies, friends of the Schiller Institute, dear conference participants. Let me start with a perspective which is very well known among the countries of the Global South, which actually have become the global majority in the recent years. But this perspective is almost unknown in Europe and in the United States. I'm talking about the fact that a new world system is in the process of being built, a polycentric, harmonious world, a multi-nodal world, a world which is becoming more just, where every country has the right to develop, can choose their own path of development according to their own culture, their own tradition, their own philosophy. And this is already happening. It is very much advanced in different forms. For example, it is growing in the form of the BRICS countries, which already since the summit in Johannesburg last year have grown from 5 to 10. Now there are 59 more countries who have issued applications to join. So that makes altogether already almost 70 countries. And naturally among them are China and India, which account for almost 3 billion right there. So what we are experiencing, and I think nobody in the West has an appropriate appreciation, or very few people in the West have an appropriate appreciation of that, is that we are experiencing the end of an epoch. What I mean by that is that the 600 years, which started around 1500, of colonialism and subsequent neocolonialism, which persisted even after many countries of the so-called developing sector acquired independence. But as President Nehru and Sukarno already at the Bandung conference had warned, the neocolonialism persisted in the form of denial of access to credit for development, terms of trade, and generally unjust conditions. But in the last 10 to 12 years, the prominence of the BRICS started to rise from 2014, the famous summit in Brazil. They have undergone a tremendous development. The initiative by Xi Jinping, the Belt and Road Initiative, the growth and massive industrial growth of many emerging countries like Brazil, Indonesia, Egypt, Nigeria, South Africa, and others. And all of this was naturally in part the result of the rise of China. Without the civilizational contribution of China, which is without other example and without precedent, because it lifted not only 850 million of its own people out of poverty, but it also then stretched out the hands and provided through corridors, through development projects, through industrial parks, the hand to the other developing countries to start this growth process on their own. In part, it was the rise of China, but in part, it was also the blowback of the attempt after the collapse of the Soviet Union to establish an unipolar world by the neocons in the United States and their co-thinkers in Great Britain. And Francis Fukuyama's famous end of history meant actually that there was a hubris in which, they pursued the idea that the whole world, every single country on the planet would adopt the Western neoliberal model of democracy. Now, the means by which this was supposed to be accomplished were not so nice. It included regime change against countries who wouldn't go along with this, color revolutions by using civil organizations, NGOs, to destabilize existing elected governments. It was based on interventionist wars, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and others. It was based on a brutal regime of sanctions, unilateral sanctions, not backed by the UN Security Council, which always would not aim at the regimes, but actually punish the populations in order to get them to rise up against their government. It included weaponization of the dollar and the euro. Now, all of these factors created a dynamic in which there was the emergence of a powerful movement against neocolonialism, of countries who are demanding their right for their own development. They do not any longer want to be just raw material exporters, where the profit of their income, of their raw materials, goes to multinationals, cartels, and the banks. But increasingly, really inspired by the example of China, countries wanted to have the creation of the value chain in their own country, develop their own industrial production, become middle-level income countries in the near future. Now, if we would be thinking straight, we in Europe and the United States should be happy about this. This would mean the end to the migration crisis, which is bothering a lot of people in Europe and in the United States, and which in large part contributed to the recent election result in the European Union, European Parliament election. Shouldn't we be happy that young people from Africa, Asia, Latin America would want to stay home, help to build their own country instead of dying of thirst and hunger in the Sahara or drowning in the Mediterranean trying to reach Europe, or being shot at the Mexican-American border? Countries like Germany, Italy, Switzerland, France, the United States, Japan are all export-oriented countries. We should support the countries in the developing, growing markets so that they become well-to-do and wealthy, and we have growing markets. It's an absolute win-win situation. Now, why are we then on the verge of World War III? Now, the NATO narrative of an unprovoked Russian war of aggression in Ukraine assumes that the entire world population has historic amnesia, that we don't remember the time of the German unification where we from the Schiller Institute were an absolute active force in the middle of, and we are part of this, so we don't need to read books about it. This was our history. We remember the promises to Gorbachev that NATO would not move 1 inch to the east. We remember the discussions, hopeful discussions about a common European house, a common economic space from Vladivostok to Lisbon. And then 5 expansions of NATO eastward did occur. The Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the Rose Revolution in Georgia, the Maidan, which was a U.S. and Western-backed coup against a democratically elected government. We still remember Victoria Nuland's famous utterings, which I don't want to repeat here because it's not ladylike. We remember Merkel and Hollande admitting that Minsk II, or their participation in Minsk II, was only a trick to give the Ukrainians more time to be trained to a NATO standard. I can only sketch these developments here, but that's enough to paint the panorama of things happening now. Now, the situation on the battlefield in Ukraine is near stalemate. The Ukrainian counteroffensive from the summer 23 clearly failed. There is a clear Russian advantage, but due to the massive Western weapon supply, Russia is not able to just run over the remaining depleted Ukrainian forces because new weapons are being sent, more powerful weapons, and we are in a spiral of escalation. Macron infamously was demanding to send ground troops. Many of those are already there in the form of advisors. Cameron of Great Britain allowed the use of Western weapon systems, cruise missiles, then increasingly the idea of long-range missiles to be used deep into the territory of Russia. And Putin, in response to these explicitly named Western provocations, for the first time had maneuvers with tactical nuclear weapons. Well, the West ignored this. Blinken afterwards doubled down and said, yes, you can use the weapon systems for attacks into Russian territory. So this caused Putin to make a second maneuver in Russia, plus in Belarus. Then came the attack on the Russian radar early warning system in Amavir and attempted also in Orsk. Now, these attacks had nothing to do with the Ukrainian war, but the only way Russia could read this was that this was an attempt to knock out the second strike capability, meaning, a nuclear strike against Russia. Clear, this would not have been possible without NATO assistance, without U.S. technical assistance, and therefore the perception in Russia has been steadily rising that NATO is de facto already at war with Russia. Now, in the West, the narrative also is increasingly spreading that war is inevitable. German Defense Minister Pistorius went into this incredible campaign that Germany must become war ready again. After our history, we should go that path again. Is this man of a clear mind? And are the German people who are just swallowing this as if nothing would have happened, are they of a clear mind? Now, the war with Russia, according to Pistorius, will take place in 2029. Russia must lose, says Baerbock and other such incredibly wise people. Ukraine must win. Now, that creates a dilemma because the Russian defeat is excluded. Forget about it. Russia is the strongest nuclear power on the planet, and it will never capitulate. That is completely out of the equation. Now, on one level, in Russia, people think that on the level where people really run the show, not on the level of Biden, Blinken, but the real powers to be, the decision has already been made. The order already has been given to go to war with Russia. That is according to all witnesses, the consensus in Russia right now. Now, in response to the Russian attacks in Kharkiv, the attacks on civilian targets in Belgorod escalated, and they are regarded in Russia as terrorist attacks because they mainly hit children, civilians, and so forth. So in Russia, the consensus in the discussion, and one could hear that on the sidelines of the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, the consensus is that this has all gone too far already. And therefore, a discussion has erupted about a decapitating strike. At the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, Putin had a discussion where it was chosen, obviously deliberately, to make Karaganov the moderator. And he is known to be the first strike guy in Russia, the decapitation strike man. And, contrary to Karaganov, we are quite happy that Putin is very patient, and he made again and again very clear that the Russian strategic doctrine is that Russia will use nuclear weapons only if the territorial integrity of Russia is threatened, but also have symmetric and asymmetric responses to Ukrainian attacks, Western-backed attacks. Now, the biggest danger is that if the West starts to believe in their own narrative that Putin is only bluffing, I don't think Putin is bluffing, and that myth has to be eradicated because that is the one of the many ingredients which can lead to a catastrophe. Russia has also said, if there are ground troops, NATO ground troops in Ukraine, or the stationing of F-16, which are dual use capable, then not only those troops and military items on the ground will be hit, but also the decision-making centers where the order was given to deploy these. Now, today or yesterday, we read in the newspapers the decision that the command for the Ukraine war was transferred from Ramstein in Germany to a NATO command in Wiesbaden. Now, for those people who know what that means for us, it's a very uncomfortable place to be in the future. If one considers how the United States is treating interests of the allies, as we for sure will hear by Rainer Rupp later on this panel, and which is also very graphically described by Klaus von Donani, the former Lord Mayor of Hamburg, in a book where he describes how in NATO maneuvers there was no concern by the Americans if some nuclear bombs would be dropped on Germany. That was just a casualty to be taken into account. Now, that is obviously a very frightening perspective. Today also starts the Swiss conference in Burgenstock, based on the Zelensky formula to have a so-called Ukraine peace conference, which before it even started is doomed to fail because Russia is not invited. And just also today, Putin made a new peace proposal for Ukraine, where he basically proposes the territory where the population voted to be part of Russia. All Western Ukrainian troops should be withdrawn. And, there should be an absolute final word that Ukraine never will become part of NATO. So what do the mainstream media do? They start to insult Putin by saying, oh, Putin is fabulating again. What is he talking about? But this is still on the path of confrontation and the road to escalate until it is too late. What we need is a new global security and development conference which takes into account the interest of every single country on the planet. And the obvious model has to be the Peace of Westphalia, which in 1648 ended 150 years of religious war, of which the 30 Years' War was only the last phase. The reason why people came to their senses, because 1/3 of everything was destroyed already. 1/3 of the people, the cattle, the villages. And they realized if the war would go on, there would be nobody alive to enjoy the victory. Now, is that not the case all the more in the times of thermonuclear weapons, where we will all be dead if it ever comes to a global nuclear war, and we are on the verge of it, on the edge of it? Because such a global war, according to the best scientists, will be followed by probably 10 years of a nuclear winter in which all life on the planet will disappear. Now, yesterday, President Putin proposed a new security system, apart from the proposal for Ukraine, a new system of indivisible security in Europe based on the greater Eurasian partnership. And Putin said, and who wants to deny that, geography cannot be changed. We have to live together somehow. This security system is open to European and NATO countries, he said. Now, going back to the beginning of my remarks, this new world system is emerging, this polycentric, harmonious, multinodal system. Xi Jinping has called often in the last years for a shared community of the one future of humanity. But this is a beautiful idea which has been around for many centuries. It's not new. Leibniz, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, in the 17th century, famously said that the two most advanced civilizations on the two poles of the Eurasian continent should stretch out their hands and work together to develop all the countries in between, develop the South together. Friedrich List, the most famous German economist, when he was discussing the continuous building of infrastructure around the globe until it finally would connect the entire globe through such trains and other systems, an early vision of our World Land Bridge proposal actually created the notion of a space-time economy, where he had the idea that an increasing interconnectivity of global infrastructure will create the condition to exchange creative ideas in science and art, and it will become the economy of mankind, where eventually all nations would unite in what he called a republic of the planet. Tsai Yuan-pai, who was the first education minister of the Sun Yat-sen government and later president of the University of Beijing, and the man who brought the concept of aesthetic education of Schiller into China. He had a beautiful vision of a great community of the entire world. In Chinese, the Datong Shixue. Now, this is no longer a vision for the future. It is here. And rather than tumble into the last world war, after which there will be nothing, let us join the global majority. Thank you.
And if you've just joined us, we welcome you from all over the world to today's international conference of the Schiller Institute, The World on the Brink for a New Peace of Westphalia. You've just heard the keynote speech given by the head of the Schiller Institute, Helga Zepp-LaRouche. Helga is the author of the 10 Principles for a New Strategic and Development Architecture. We're going to display that on your screen here as you're seeing now, and you'll be able to retrieve this from the chat at the bottom of your screen. She is also the initiator of the International Peace Coalition, and I would also like to especially welcome those attending our conference today that have been participating in that organization, formed 1 year ago and in continuous meeting every Friday since that time. We encourage everyone to become involved in that. Our next speaker is Chas Freeman, U.S. China scholar and retired diplomat of the U.S. Foreign Services.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor to join the Schiller Institute in today's conference. Someone must speak out for peace. Someone must advocate and organize diplomacy rather than war as the answer to the tensions now afflicting Europe. I want to commend the Institute and Helga Zepp-LaRouche, its founder and leader, for speaking out and for convening us. We are here to sound the alarm about where the cycle of escalation and counter-escalation between NATO and the Russian Federation is taking Europe, Russia, and America, and to consider what to do about this. Red lines have been drawn, then repeatedly abandoned. Each side has said it will not do this or that, and then gone ahead and done it. Now, in response to NATO backing direct Ukrainian strikes on targets deep inside Russian territory, Russia is not only striking back at strategic targets in Ukraine, but threatening retaliation elsewhere. What has been a proxy war now risks becoming direct conflict between the United States, NATO, and the Russian Federation. The good news is that President Putin has said that, at least for now, he does not plan to retaliate against Western escalation of attacks on his homeland with his enormous nuclear arsenal. But it's a sign of how dangerous this moment is that he has announced that he will instead arm the enemies of the United States and other NATO countries involved in attacking Russia. It's unclear whether he means to restrict this reprisal to states or whether he will include non-state actors. That's bad enough, but given the short half-life to date of any red line involving Ukraine, his next retaliatory step could well be nuclear. Sometimes history is the product of strategic design, sometimes of miscalculations and blunders. The peace managed by the Council of Europe was an artifact of statecraft. World War I was a mishap that ushered in almost a half century of ruinous turmoil. Bretton Woods and the post-World War II order were the creations of statesmen. Ours is an age of irrational antagonisms, born of strategic misjudgments and bungling. It's off to a dangerous start. There's renewed warfare between great powers in Europe and open antagonism between the United States and China. It's pointless to ask who is to blame. Future generations of historians will render judgments on this that transcend our current passions. The international system in which we've cooperated and prospered is disintegrating. For 73 years, from 1944 to 2017, the world was mainly regulated by internationally agreed norms, obligations, and conventions grounded in the United Nations Charter. This system was originally advocated by Washington, though not necessarily always respected by it. It worked out well for the United States until many Americans thought it did not. Then a disgruntled American electorate elected a populist administration that was long on resentment of the constraints of the international order, untutored in statecraft, economically nationalist, and indifferent to critical foreign opinion. The current U.S. administration has doubled down on both its predecessors' national security-based protectionism and its economic warfare against presumed adversaries. And it's doggedly sought to extend the American sphere of influence in Europe to the very borders of Russia, while dismissing Moscow's objections and refusing to acknowledge, let alone address, its strategic concerns. Russia has not ceased to propose negotiations to devise a security architecture in Europe in which it does not feel threatened by the United States and its European allies, and Europeans similarly do not feel threatened by Russia. The United States and NATO have consistently refused to talk with Russia about this. The stated aim of the West is to isolate and weaken Russia. The results of this policy and the sanctions adopted to promote it have been, first, to decouple Russia from Europe and North America and reorient it toward China, India, the Middle East, and Africa. Second, to revive the Russian economy and deindustrialize Germany and other members of the European Union formerly dependent on Russian energy supplies. In purchasing power terms, Russia now has the largest economy in Europe. Third, to double the size of the Russian defense budget, armed forces, and armaments production, and to stimulate Russian development of effective counters to NATO's military doctrines and weaponry. And fourth, to catalyze the alienation of the so-called global South or global majority from the West, and to isolate the West in global institutions. For Ukraine, whose abandonment of its neutrality provided the casus belli for Russia, the war has been a national catastrophe. Ukraine has lost 1/3 of its population and an entire generation of brave men of military age. It has already lost 1/5 of its territory, and it lacks the capacity to prevent further losses. Its infrastructure has been devastated. Before this war, Ukraine was the poorest and most corrupt country in Europe. It has been further impoverished. War fosters corruption, and Ukraine is more corrupt than ever. Ukraine's democracy has been superseded by martial law. Its political parties have been outlawed, its media nationalized, and its elections canceled. It is now more authoritarian than Russia and far less tolerant of ethno-linguistic diversity. The West's proxy war on Russia has clearly been a failure. It has enhanced Russia's global influence and strengthened it militarily. It has not prevented Russia from gutting Ukraine, and it has raised, rather than allayed, fears of a wider war in Europe. It now threatens to go nuclear. You might suppose that what has happened would lead the West and Ukraine to stop reinforcing failure and to seek a diplomatic rather than a military solution to a situation that increasingly threatens not just the peace and prosperity of Europe, but escalation to the nuclear level. But no, the United States and NATO are doubling down on a purely military approach to managing European security and relations with the Russian Federation. The West has no strategy that holds out any realistic prospect of regaining any of the territory that Ukraine has lost. Ukraine is in fact in danger of losing still more, possibly endangering its access to the Black Sea. And there is no war termination strategy. Instead, the West proposes to fight to the last Ukrainian and continues to dream of imposing a humiliating defeat on Russia, the very outcome that Russian military doctrine stipulates would justify Moscow's use of nuclear weapons against its attackers. Meanwhile, President Zelensky has joined the West in insisting there can be no negotiations with Russia to end the war. The course we are following is based on miscalculations and blunders. It is a march of folly that, if continued, leads only to tragedy. It is destroying Ukraine. It has taken us to the brink of nuclear war between the United States, NATO, and the Russian Federation. But it is not too late to take another path. Once before, the world trembled at the prospect of a nuclear exchange that would have made our planet uninhabitable. That was the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. It led President John F. Kennedy to the conclusion that we should, quote, never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate, unquote. That is as sound advice today as it was 62 years ago. We should learn from the contrast between the way in which the Napoleonic Wars ended and how we ended World War I. The conveners of the Congress of Vienna were careful to include their former French enemy in the crafting of what became the Concert of Europe, an arrangement based on the balance of power that kept Europe largely at peace for a whole century. The victors in World War I excluded both Germany and Russia from any role in the management of the peace negotiated at Versailles. The result was World War II, followed by the Cold War. There can be no peace in Europe based on the ostracism of Russia or any other great European power. In many ways, the breakdown of the post-Cold War peace in Europe has brought us to what Chancellor Scholz called a Zeitenwende, a turning point in history that demands the crafting of a new order in international relations. Helga Zepp-LaRouche has likened this challenge to that faced by the nations of Europe after the 30 Years' War. It took protracted negotiations to produce the Peace of Westphalia and overcome the religious, territorial, and regime change impulses that had devastated Central Europe The understandings that grew from that peace live on. They were affirmed by the newly independent states of the post-colonial era at Bandung in 1955 in the form of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. These are mutual respect for each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty, mutual non-aggression, mutual non-interference in each other's internal affairs, equality, and cooperation for mutual benefit, and peaceful coexistence. It's time for Europe, including Russia, to rediscover and adapt its diplomatic heritage to the challenges of the day. The outcome of the recent European parliamentary elections suggests that Europeans are ready for new thinking about Europe's future. Interestingly, it's the European right, like the American right, which is most disillusioned by the forever war in Ukraine and most dissatisfied with the economic decline of the West. I think there's a basis for something like the conferences in Münster and Osnabrück that crafted the Peace of Westphalia to explore and affirm principles for a new European order that can bring peace to Ukraine, refashion European-American relations to enhance European strategic autonomy, bring Russia back to an appropriate relationship with the rest of Europe, and create international understandings to sustain security and stability in Europe. But are there leaders with the imagination, drive, and diplomatic skills to accomplish this? We must hope that there are. If there are not, the risks are high and the prospects dire. I look forward to a lively discussion among the distinguished participants in this conference for the roughly 2 hours in which I will be able to join it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Freeman. And if you've just joined us, we welcome you from all over the world to today's international conference of the Schiller Institute, The World on the Brink for a New Peace of Westphalia. You are attending panel 1 of that conference, Europe after the European elections. And you've just heard Chas Freeman, U.S. China scholar and retired diplomat of the United States Foreign Service. Our next speaker is Dr. Olga Lazorkina, the head of the Foreign Policy Department of the Belarusian Institute of Strategic Research of the nation of Belarus. Welcome.
Thank you. Dear organizers, I'd like to express my gratitude for the invitation to speak at the conference. Dear colleagues, our countries have always been separated by geography, great distances, but it could never serve as a barrier to ordinary human communication. Here in Belarus, we understand that today each of the countries emphasizes its priority positions in politics, economics, and analytics. But we live on one planet. We are responsible for everything that happens. That's why it is so important not to only declare our priorities, but also to find common ground with others. This is what I see as the mission of our country. In any circumstances, look for ways for dialogue for the common good. For my part, I'd like to present several trends that define the global and regional agenda for Belarus. Analysis of the current global economic and political processes shows that the world has entered a phase of transformation, which in many respects was inevitable. Many changes, which we didn't always attach importance to, have now accumulated a critical mass and triggered processes we can't reverse. We see that the geopolitical confrontation, which threatens to escalate into another large-scale escalation, is based on the exhaustion of the ideological and value narratives of the Western world. In fact, they have become a full-scale obstacle to the development not only of the adherents but also of the countries that once respected them. Economic globalization, perceived by most countries as an element of common image of the future, has transformed into a vast mechanism of pressure and restraint of economic development. However, we also see positive trends within its framework. The importance of national interests, sovereignty, preservation of the diversity of cultures and tradition has increased. For the first time since 1945, the world community is facing a new war. The worst thing about it will be that everyone realizes how it may end and does nothing to stop at the dangerous line. For many years, we have built cooperation with a variety of partners, trusted the formulas of peaceful coexistence. No one can reproach us for not trying this recipe. The result is stunning. Double standards permeate democracy. The world is entangled in a web of sanctions. As of 2023, there are 183 regional conflicts, a 30-year record. We therefore conclude that the great ideas of democracy have run out of steam, and this will cost the global community dearly. Conflict potential has proved to be stronger than pragmatism, ambition stronger than reason. We can see that the struggle for resources, influence, status overstretches the world community. Therefore, all states are looking for new formats of coexistence, and we are not talking about cancelling anyone, but about revision of sensible forces in world politics and singling out those with the potential to move into the future. The request of transformation of the world order is long overdue. Multipolarity is taking hold in the world economic and political processes. It is no longer possible to slow down, let alone stop this movement. Today, no one wants to be on the sidelines. For many years, Belarus has been talking from international tribunes about the destruction of international law and the canons of diplomacy. Today, we also see a purposeful work to devalue international institutions, which have mechanisms of stabilization of the situation, authority, and most importantly, we were created by incredible work of the entire world community. Belarus, more than any other country, realizes the danger of the current situation. 2 world wars have run their wheels through our people. The contribution of our country to preserving peace, stability, and creating equal conditions for all countries within the frameworks of the United Nations and other international organizations can hardly be overestimated. There is not a single international initiative on which Belarus has not declared its position. The international recognition of our country as an independent state in the 1990s was unprecedented in terms of support, and it was largely due to our tremendous work on international platforms. In the 1990s, we not only preserved but also continued to actively participate in the settlement of various problems. After the attack of the United States on 11 of September, terrorism was transferred to the category of international problem. The United States of America appealed to the world community to create an international coalition to fight terrorism. Almost all countries joined, Belarus among them responded to the call. However, today we clearly see that the security situation in our region requires not geopolitical verbiage, but special competences, deep understanding of the problems in their historical context and responsibility. We are not speculating, but as before, we are proposing concrete action plans based on real possibilities. In the context of a deep crisis of trust, which has gained global proportions, preserving the only structure that is recognized and authoritative platform for meeting of representatives with opposed views and opinions is vital. Yes, the realities today are such that United Nations mechanism cannot always work, but this does not mean that they cannot be used. We're also looking for other international platforms that have the potential to ensure stability in various spheres. The value block of such associations as solidarity, cooperation, and partnership meets the demands of most countries. I mean BRICS, Eurasian Union. They are on the way to developing alternative mechanism of global economic development without rejecting the existing ones. We are building strategic relations with Russia. The Union State is an organic association based on a solid foundation of friendship and continuity. It's in fact the only association in our region that has a solid tested legal basis for cooperation, which allows us to preserve our sovereignty, strengthen our international legal personality, and develop our economy in line with global trends. Of course, we are not disconnected from the tragedy unfolding on our borders. The president of Belarus has repeatedly offered his vision of the crisis resolution. Belarusian Foreign Minister Sergei Aleynik emphasized that the Minsk platform is always open for negotiations. It is in our common interest. There is no more important issue for our common European home today. We are sure that there can be no negotiations without Belarus, and regional security is impossible without Belarus. Today's meetings, dear colleagues, today's meetings demonstrate the efforts of rational forces such as scientists, analysts, and experts to stabilize the global situation using all means at their disposal. Each country has a distinct weight value. Belarus is preparing to reveal its unique development strategy centered on trust, treaty-making ability, and progressive advancement. Thank you for attention.
And thank you very much, Dr. Lazorkina, for your contribution. If you've just joined us, we want to welcome you from all over the world to today's International Conference of the Schiller Institute, The World on the Brink for a New Peace of Westphalia. And you've just heard Dr. Olga Lazorkina, the head of the Foreign Policy Department of the Belarusian Institute of Strategic Research of the nation of Belarus. I'd also like to acknowledge her colleague, Mr. Vitaly Romanovsky, who we will be hearing from, I believe, a little bit later in the program. Our next speaker is Professor Georgy Toloraya, the director of the Center for Asian Strategy of the Institute of Economics of the Russian Academy of Sciences. A problem with this.
Excuse me, I didn't hear the.
Well, we're okay. Maybe there's a technical problem, but well. First of all, I introduced you. We welcomed you. Can you hear us now?
It says there's no connection.
Okay. Well, we're able to hear you. We can hear.
Do you hear me?
Yes. Yes. And we've introduced you. So
All right. Somehow I hear no sound at all. I'm just wondering if can anybody give me a sign that I can speak, okay? All right. There's no sound for me. All right. First of all, let me thank the Schiller Institute for organizing this very important conference in a very timely manner, because we just on these days, there are many events which are related to the topic of today's conference, and especially this first session on the European situation. We heard Helga LaRouche, Zepp-LaRouche, being very eloquent on the dangers of the current European situation. And in fact, we can say that now in Europe, the global fate, the fate of the globe is being decided. It is doubly important that just during the couple last days, we had two major propositions by President Putin of Russia, first on the St. Petersburg forum, and another one at the meeting with the foreign ministry diplomats, where he has presented some suggestions for the peace talks on the Ukrainian crisis. These suggestions has already been denounced by the West as non-realistic, but in fact, this is a solid basis for further discussion. And as Helga has rightly mentioned, we will have to get out of this crisis sooner or later. Europe and Eurasia is closely connected geographically, historically, and civilizationally, and anywhere a new system of European or Eurasian security will have to be set up. And President Putin's suggestions are much broader than just concrete proposals for solving the Ukrainian crisis. They also include ideas on setting new principles for Eurasian security, for the whole continent, rules of behavior and major principles of international relations, which are, of course, based on the United Nations Charter principles, but should be more transparent and more just, not the rules-based order, which is set by the West and which the West suggests to be the basis for the international relations. It should be clearly said that in Russia, I think no one actually thinks that the war in Ukraine is a sort of aggression against a sovereign state. Ukraine, this territory, and especially its eastern part, has long been the part of the Russian Empire and Russia proper. So the most of the population sees it as another case of a war with the West, with the collective West, on a historical Russian territory. The war is not going on in Europe. It's going on in historical Russian territory. And these are Russian Ukrainian people, which are actually ethnically the same, or very close. They're dying in the course of this war. And the origin of this war is the desire to contain Russia and to make it subordinate to the so-called rules-based order. And the lesson for both experts and Russian people that the West will stop at nothing in order to preserve its privileges, in order to preserve its dominant position, which lets the so-called golden billion to enjoy the life at the expense of others, at the expense of, in fact, global majority, or what is now called in Russia global South and global East. But today the situation has changed, and now, like in colonial time, European powers tried to meddle into regional conflicts and to decide the fates of the faraway countries and people in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Now the newly emerged civilization and newly emerged countries offer their good offices to solve the crisis in Europe. this is what China does. This is what other BRICS countries do. And this is the difference from the past. In this connection, I want to say a couple of words about the BRICS new role. President Putin mentioned in his speech at the Foreign Minister that BRICS may be a key element of the new global governance. And that's what it is now becoming. You know that the BRICS, for the last 15 years, the BRICS have been the alliance of the biggest country civilizations: Russia, China, Brazil, India, South Africa, which represented the whole region. And the criteria for BRICS was the size of this membership, was the size of the territory, population, and GNP. However, the things have changed since last year. And the result of this change was this open conflict between one of the BRICS countries, representing the newly emerging powers, Russia, and the collective West in Ukraine. That was the real cause why the interest to BRICS have considerably increased in the global South and global East. And in Johannesburg summit last year in South Africa, new countries were ascended to BRICS. Now we have 10 countries in BRICS. And this signaled, in fact, the end of the old BRICS and the beginning of a new BRICS. BRICS not as an alliance of different civilizations, but rather as a negotiation platform of the global South and global majority and the dominant West. That's the role of the BRICS now. And in this connection, I would like to draw your attention to the recent meeting of the foreign ministers of BRICS countries and other interested countries in Nizhny Novgorod just 3 days ago. That was the first political level meeting after the joining of the new countries, and the new countries, namely Egypt, Iran, United Arab Emirates, Ethiopia, they undersigned the documents which determines the strategy of BRICS. So they agreed to be in the same boat and to defend the same principle and follow the same course. Moreover, 12 other countries participated in the meeting on the second day of this meeting. And some countries like Thailand, they have officially submitted their application to become the BRICS member. And there are about 50 more countries which are interested. That means that BRICS has become a global phenomenon which has formulated its principles and which has formulated its strategy for a new world order. A new world order where not the West would dominate, but rather there should be a consensus, what you call Westphalian style, equal partnership of the countries of the world for the common good. The chance to take part in the solution of the European crisis, Ukrainian crisis for the BRICS countries is a real test whether China, India, and other countries can contribute to doing this job. And maybe after that, we will see quite a new stage of development of international relations and the ascension to the new principles, which will correspond to what the Schiller Institute have suggested and what Russia generally share. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Toloraya, and we apologize for the technical problem. It was worth hearing you, very much worth hearing you. Thank you very much. And if you've just joined us, welcome to today's International Conference of the Schiller Institute, The World on the Brink for a New Peace of Westphalia. You're attending the first panel of that conference, and you've just heard Professor Georgy Toloraya, the director of the Center for Asian Strategy, Institute of Economics of the Russian Academy of Sciences. Our next speaker is Dr. Caroline Galactéros, who is a former member of the Institute for Higher Studies of National Defense of France, a reserve colonel also, and we will now hear her offering.
Mesdames et messieurs, bonsoir. Je suis très heureuse d'intervenir devant vous. Je suis navrée de le faire à distance. Je remercie l'Institut Schiller de m'avoir conviée malgré tout à pouvoir répondre à quelques questions. Alors, pour être simple, je vais reposer les questions qui m'ont été posées. La première question était: que pouvez-vous dire de la propagande de guerre, tant du point de vue européen que surtout français? Alors, je vais me limiter à...
Yeah, we had a problem in our transmission. What we're going to try to do is to start again because I think our translation was muted. Okay, we're ready now? Very good.
Mesdames et messieurs, bonsoir.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening.
Je suis très heureuse
I'm very pleased to be
d'intervenir
able to
devant
talk
vous.
to
Je suis
you.
navrée de le faire à distance.
I'm sorry to do it from a distance. I'd like to thank the Schiller Institute for inviting me to answer a few questions, to keep things simple. I'm going to repeat the questions that were put to me. The first question was, what can you say about war propaganda, both from a European and above all a French point of view? I'll limit my comments to the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, or rather Russian-NATO conflict. Obviously, for the last 2.5 years, propaganda has been total, massive, permanent, dramatic in its effects and consequences, both on the dynamic of the conflict itself, because it leads us to take positions based on a narrative that doesn't fit with reality, and also on the dynamics and consequences it can have, including on the evolution of public opinion, with fairly direct political consequences. I think that's what we're seeing right now in France with the announcement of the dissolution of the National Assembly by the President of the French Republic. In this conflict, propaganda is increasingly driven by the need perceived by the political powers in Europe, and particularly in France, to feed a warmongering posture. The worse things get on the ground, the more propaganda is added, reaching new heights of absurdity every day. The latest summits are, of course, the French presidential declarations, explaining that France is on the side of peace, which is becoming quite complicated to illustrate if we look at the real declarations of intent we're making concerning arms deliveries, if we look at the whole raft of decisions taken concerning frozen Russian assets, concerning our support via the bilateral security agreement between Ukraine and France, and so on and so on. We're on the side of peace, but in fact we're feeding the war. And I find it hard to believe that we don't understand the consequences of our positions. Another recent stance, which is also extremely damaging for our credibility, is obviously the statement of the president, who explained that if we had given in to Russia's policy of intimidation towards the West, we would not have delivered all the arms we did to Ukraine. And so Ukraine would not be in the situation it is in today. I have to say this is really too much, because I totally agree. If we had been cautious and temperate enough not to give in to the temptation of making these deliveries and fueling this conflict, then Ukraine would not be in the position this in today. That is in an extremely worrisome position, both in terms of military and human terms, extremely damaging to its interest as a country. There was a peace proposal which has been accepted only days after the beginning of the conflict. Zelensky was ready to accept it. It was destroyed by us, and in particular by the British, through the voice of Boris Johnson, who came to explain to Ukraine that it was there to make war and not peace. So, and then, unfortunately, we got into the terrible spiral we're in today. So we could have had peace much more quickly and with many fewer deaths, hundreds of thousands fewer deaths and wounded. So we're kind of schizophrenia. Is it a tactical or is it real? We are locking ourselves into a doomed, self-fulfilling prophecy. Is this the strategy of the worst? I find that hard to believe. Of course, there's arrogance. Of course, there's ignorance. But of all, there's a lack of understanding of military reality and the real state of the balance of power. Then, two other questions were posed to me. The second was, how can France contribute to a positive solution from a purely national point of view? And the third question, at several occasions, General de Gaulle lost his temper at the French tendency to give up even before fighting. What do you think we can do after the result of the European elections? It's good that I recorded my statements after the results of these elections and the decision of the French president to dissolve the National Assembly. Well, I think that like in all crises, this is an opportunity, and that's how we should see it. However, whatever the reasons for this dissolution, they are not necessarily, this can be for tactical calculations, but nevertheless, we are in this situation, and I think it's an opportunity to France to make a very clear change of foot, change of position, and that obviously requires courage. But maybe cohabitation can enable this change of foot. Paradoxically, we need to take advantage of this cohabitation and make a fairly radical turn in our approach to the conflict to try to make ourselves useful. And we make ourselves useful essentially when we are a power like France, nuclear, of course, which above all has a great history. We must, and to join the goal, rediscover a great foreign policy. And in this conflict, to be useful, we obviously need to de-align, not to realign ourselves with Russia or anyone else, obviously, but perhaps to join forces in an alliance of circumstance that would be for world peace and the restoration of European security. And I'm thinking of China, because it's with China that we could perhaps seek to promote a path of appeasement, not by explaining to China that it must separate from Russia. That's not likely to happen, but to go to define the terms of a path of appeasement and to bring stabilization and security in Europe, which is, after all, the Europeans' number one problem. We have certainly fallen into a trap, a double trap, and Europe is clearly an American proxy in this conflict, as is Ukraine. Not in the first level, the unfortunate Ukraine, but we're right behind, and that's the most dramatic thing. We need to go out of this downward spiral, which is always becoming extremely dangerous because we don't measure or understand Russian positions. There are a certain number of points which have already been raised and listed by great diplomats, by people who are perfectly capable of understanding what the terms of a realistic agreement would be, allowing hostilities to cease in Ukraine and safeguarding what remains of Ukraine and its population today. That's all I wanted to say. Once again, I'm sorry I can take part in these debates more actively and the various questions. But that will be no doubt be for another time when I hope to have the opportunity to be there in person. Thank you very much, and I wish you a very good conference.
And thank you, Dr. Galactéros. We welcome that later conversation as well. If you have just joined us, welcome from all over the world to today's conference of the Schiller Institute, The World on the Brink for a New Peace of Westphalia. If you've been with us from the beginning, you've heard from the nations of Russia, of Belarus, France, in the form of Helga Zepp-LaRouche, Germany, and the United States. And we are in panel one of the conference, Europe after the European elections. And that was thus Dr. Caroline Galactéros, a political scientist from France, former auditor with the Institute for Higher Studies of National Defense. Our next speaker is Lieutenant Colonel retired Ralph Bosshard of the Swiss Armed Forces. He's also a consultant in military and strategic affairs.
Welcome to you all, of course. Hello from Switzerland. Generally speaking, we are currently in a global stalemate in which everyone is dependent on each other and no one is able to act unilaterally. Currently, Russia cannot persuade the United States to have serious talks, not on Ukraine, not on other topics. The USA cannot deal with the situation in the Middle East without Russia and Iran. Russia cannot continue the war without China and the BRICS Plus group of countries. The United States cannot pose a threat to China that causes China to change its policy towards Moscow and or BRICS to Moscow's disadvantage. And fifth, Ukraine cannot draw other countries into a war against Russia on its side. We will see that this weekend during the so-called peace conference in Switzerland. A fundamental change in the situation, therefore, is unlikely. In view of the United States' looming lack of interest in further involvement in the war and Ukraine's military failures, the only question that remains is who wants to continue fighting as a kind of last Mohicans in Ukraine. Since the Ukrainian withdrawal from Avdiivka, the front in Donbass has been slipping. It is not important that the Russians are capturing 1 or 2 villages a day, villages that have been completely devastated anyway, but that they have broken through front lines to very well fortified defense lines that the Ukrainians have been building up over the course of 8 years. At present, it is noticeable that the Russians are carrying out small-scale attacks at widely separated points of the front, and that they have clearly expanded their attacks into neighboring regions, such as Kharkov Oblast and a couple of days ago, Sumy. They are clearly superior in numbers and they can move their troops at will. And they are forcing the Ukrainians to carry out probably costly counterattacks. The Russians are proceeding slowly and cautiously, but surely. And they have had hardly ever to give up territory that they conquered in the past few weeks or even months, at least since last autumn. In the meantime, the Ukrainians have lost almost all of the territorial gains that they made during the summer offensive last year. So over the last 2 years, the West has seen how all of its wonder weapons, as they used to call it, have caused, of course, damage on the Russian side, but they have not been able to turn the tide. And now, realistically, I think the West will have to prepare itself to the fact that the US delivered ATACMS and the F-16 fighter planes will not turn the tide either. The war is now in a phase in which a defeat of Ukraine can only be averted by massive strikes against strategic targets far inside Russia. Furthermore, there is a great fear to be felt in the Ukrainian community that the United States could abandon Ukraine, could leave them in the lurch. This fear may motivate Kiev to try and show itself as a useful partner of the United States and the West in general in an maybe upcoming nuclear war against Russia. There is one section along the entire front line in eastern Ukraine now where the current front still corresponds to the so-called contact line of the years 2015 to 2022. And that is the area of Gorlovka or Horlivka, if you will, and Toretsk. Here, the Russians will not let up until the cities in the Donbass are beyond the range of Ukrainian artillery and missiles, of course. The same, by the way, applies to Belgorod. Russia, in negotiations, should there be such negotiations, will probably demand a buffer zone. And the more standoff weapons the West supplies to Ukraine, the wider and deeper this buffer zone will be. Permission to use Western standoff weapons that was granted the other day against Russian territory, of course, could backfire in future negotiations. If you speak to the Russians, and of course I do speak to my former classmates in the General Staff Academy regularly, you will feel that people believe they are not so much at war with Ukraine, but rather with NATO and the West as a whole, which, as they believe, is trying to destroy Russia. Accordingly, the determination to resist is high, but the focus of the confrontation could shift from the Donbass and Ukraine in general to other world regions. Russia will be trying to demonstrate that it can defend itself, and Western forces are no longer a cause for alarm, not in the Kremlin, not in Russia in general. That's due to the fact that the Ukrainian army, which is equipped, trained, supported, and possibly even led by NATO officers, has not been successful enough in the past few months. The Russian ships off the coast in Cuba are a demonstration that the sponsors of any strikes into Russian territory will receive their share of the damage as well. And I'm convinced that France, Great Britain, and Germany will be on the receiving end of strikes as well, should the need arise, of course. But so far, Russia has many ways of taking action against the Europeans and the West without directly attacking them on their own territory and without using nuclear devices. Places where Western forces or intelligence services are operating and where they should actually not be, such as Iran, for instance, Iraq, for instance, could become the scene of demonstrations, and as well as busy maritime trade routes. NATO ships and outposts are particularly at risk these days. The only thing, as I feel it, that inspires respect in Russia is the West's nuclear weapons. despite all this, I still believe that the Russian army is incapable of overrunning all of Western Europe, as we are told so often these days. I also wonder why Russia should want to do that. Claims that Russia wants to advance into Berlin or even Bern are surely based on an underestimation of the difficulties and the effort involved, on incompetence, or maybe they're just to be considered as pure propaganda. On the other hand, I can only warn against believing that Russia can now be easily brought to its knees militarily. And believe me, I've spent a year and a half in the Russian armed forces, and I have a rough idea of their capabilities and particularly what they are not capable of. It seems to me that Western forces tend to overestimate themselves, sometimes in an almost grotesque way. As far as the foreseeable future is concerned, I think we could be in for turbulent times. I expect the Birkenstock summit, peace summit as they call it in Switzerland, to be held in a calm atmosphere. I think this so-called peace conference is not important enough for the Russians to disturb it. And currently, the political losers of last weekend's elections in Europe are gathering at the G7 summit in Italy, and they will move on to Switzerland. But there could be a desire on the side of the Russians to steal the show that Biden, Macron, Scholz, and von der Leyen have surely prepared for the next few weeks and months to come. I'm speaking about the U.S. election campaign. I'm speaking about the Olympic Games in Paris and the football championship in Germany. So we could go into a turbulent phase, and if an escalation or even a nuclear war can be avoided, it will be rather due to Russian calm and Russian rationality than to a high standard of Western statecraft. Sorry for saying that, but that's honestly the way I assess the current situation. Of course, we are expecting the worst, hoping for the best, but to my experience from 20 years of service as a general staff officer at various levels, I know that hope is not a military planning method, and we should not rely on that. Thanks a lot, and goodbye from Switzerland.
Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel Bosshard. You've just heard Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Bosshard of the Swiss Armed Forces, retired. He's a consultant for military strategic affairs from Switzerland. And we want to welcome you, if you've just joined us, to today's international conference of the Schiller Institute, The World on the Brink for a New Peace of Westphalia. This is panel one of that conference, Europe after the European elections. Our next speaker is Rainer Rupp, military and intelligence expert from Germany.
Hello. Well, thanks for giving me this opportunity. From 1977 to 1993, I did start at that level, but ended as a senior administrator in NATO headquarters Political Affairs Division in Brussels. In this position, I also participated biannually at at the Winter exercises, in which NATO was exercising its first use of nuclear weapons in the, going from the conventional conflict into a nuclear conflict. And my first exercise was, in fact, in which I participated in the role of the chairman current intelligence group, where I had to brief the NATO Defense Planning Committee, which actually made the decision that was at the highest level then. And they were in continuous contact with the governments because it was a staff exercise at the highest level with the participation of the top people in ministries and in the chancellery. And so I had to brief the DPC, Defense Planning Council, every 4 hours. I mean, my duty was 8 hours per 24 hours. That's so far as a background. Now, in my first participation, the NATO actually used, after a lengthy initial part, conventional war, finally used one tactical nuclear weapon on somewhere in Eastern Europe on some Russian forces and on some Soviet forces. And then the exercise was over, no follow-on. My last Wintex exercise was in 1989. That was already when basically the Cold War was over. But the preparation of these nuclear exercises normally took 2 years. And this exercise NATO used in 2 waves about 100, if I recollect properly, 153 tactical nuclear weapons on Soviet and Eastern European forces. But, and this is the point I was trying to make, that's why I'm telling you this story, the planner of the first use of nuclear weapons were Americans. And they actually decided where these weapons would be used. And they always took great care that none, in my whole time at NATO, that none of these nuclear weapons hit Russian territory, because it was quite clear for the Americans, if that happened, then they would be hit back on U.S. territory. Now, as a result, you can imagine what would have happened in the case of a nuclear conflict, even a limited nuclear conflict. Europe would have been annihilated. And to give you just an example from one of these nuclear planning conferences in which I participated, that happened in the so-called NATO resort in Oberammergau in Germany, a conference, and there a U.S. general actually complained or lamented that in the Fulda Gap, where NATO expected a major Russian tank invasion, that in the Fulda Gap, the German villages were only half a kiloton away from each other. That means at those days, however, tactical nuclear weapons were much stronger than half a kiloton. So yesterday, it was Garland Nixon who said in his, was also on a Schiller Institute's broadcast, pointed out that in his experience, the United States forces, and planners in particular, have no respect for civilians. And especially in the nuclear planning part, I actually could witness this. Now, what is the chance that this conflict in Ukraine could turn nuclear? Now, I've been following this conflict very closely, and I've seen over the various scenarios, plausible scenarios where it could go very wrong. Now, the first one was, I was alarmed when the brigade of the 101st Screaming Eagles, that meant 5,000 airborne forces of the 101st Airborne Division were put into Eastern Europe, 4,000 into Romania, and 1,000 into Poland. And that was in end of spring already 2022. And at the end, I mean, it took a while before they were established, the housing, etc. But I can't remember the exact date, but it was end of September. The commanding officer of this group went to told the American press in a conference that we are now ready to take the order and march any time across the border into Ukraine. Well, to be what one would call a stumbling block for advancing Russian forces. Now, the Russians, however, had already then said if any American or any other NATO uniform with arms appears in Ukraine, they would annihilate them. And the airborne, the 101st Airborne, of course, it's a very famous division. I mean, lots of songs and praise. I mean, if you're American or you know the American history a bit or military history, they are highly regarded and they are legend. And to put them there as a stumbling block, and if airborne forces are lightly armored, I mean, there would not have been any resistance. They would have been decimated and slaughtered by any Russian confrontation. But there, and the Russians would not have shied back from doing so, but would have been the follow-on, the screaming of, we have to do something. We have got to do something. And we've seen this kind of thing. And in the end, what can they do? More weapons they can't do, more sanctions they can't do. So the only thing that they would be able to use would be tactical nuclear weapons against Russian forces in Ukraine. Note, Ukraine, not against Russia. Luckily enough, that has so far not happened. So next stage comes with not only Macron, but the Poles and others. We're talking about troops, sending troops, armed troops in the thousands into Ukraine, South Ukraine, via Odessa, etc. The situation would be similar. The point, quite clearly, the French would know, and the French high-level military men actually went to the press, anonymously said they will be slaughtered. Well, that is basically their idea, to sacrifice them and to call the Americans for help. And there would be plenty of people in Congress, etc., in particular in the media, to call for help. But what could the Americans do? What could NATO do? They're planning a war against, they think they would be ready to actually have a war against Russia, and conventional one, by the year 2029, because the Western or NATO military industry doesn't provide the means for anything like that any earlier. So what would they do? What could they do? The threat of using nuclear weapons would be there. And the Russians, of course, would hit back, but again, not on American homeland, but on US bases in Europe and other places of interest. Now, luckily enough, even the French plans were too much for Biden and for NATO itself. The NATO Secretary General told Macron that wouldn't be very helpful. Now, the next point is now, which makes it dicey again, is the use of long-range missiles by the Ukrainians. I mean, the release, publicly stated release of long-range nuclear missiles against strategic targets deep inside Russia, such as even targets which are part of a Russian nuclear deterrence. The Russians said that can't go on and will not go on. So because quite clearly and there is no hiding of it anymore, and even the Americans, the Brits, and others have admitted it. The intelligence, the target acquisition, the data for the feeding of the data into the missile, all this is being done by NATO personnel or personnel of the various member countries of NATO. The only thing the Ukrainians do is they press a button. Now, you are all aware of of the reaction of Russia, and they said that we will not tolerate that for much longer. So we're going to hit the bases from where these things are coming, and also outside Ukraine, meaning in NATO countries. Now there we have a situation again where then the Russians would do something which would of course call from a NATO or US reaction. And the next thing in that line, which makes it also difficult, is Zelensky and his advisors now, who were so desperate to have the F-16s in Ukraine, are now saying, well, we don't want to have them all on Ukrainian territories because they might be destroyed before we can use them. We would like to have most of them in neighboring NATO countries on air bases there. Now, this is a rather tricky thing, because if these F-16s start from neighboring air bases where they have been maintained, refueled, and maybe armed, and they just make a stopover on a Ukrainian tarmac and then fly on against Russian targets, that won't do. So it's quite clear that these NATO air bases who host the Ukrainian F-16s will be Russian targets. Now, these are the kind of things which make me, not sleep too well when I got, especially as I don't live too far away from Ramstein, which is one of the centers which is most likely to be hit. Now, I'd like to just point out one more thing. They are all saying that Putin is bluffing and they don't mean it, and the Russian nuclear doctrine is just a flimsy paper, and the Russians will never dare it, and so on. And in this particular respect, that reminded me of the care all our countries took when we built and established nuclear power stations. Everything that could go wrong in the process of production of nuclear power even if the probability was 1 in 1,000 or 1 in a million, was doubled and tripled as to have some fallback, so that this couldn't happen in the lifetime of the power station. Now, we just compare the care and we've been putting into this aspect. Well, Fukushima was bad enough, but it's not as bad as having a limited nuclear war in Europe. And while we are thinking of, oh, the Russians probably don't mean it, they are bluffing, and we can continue to do what we want. I mean, this is crazy, just full crazy. I think I've taken enough time for you for today, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rupp. We very much appreciate what you had to say. If you've just joined us again, we want to welcome everybody, but we are about to hear from our final speaker. This is panel 1 of our Schiller Institute conference, Europe after the European elections. You've just heard Rainer Rupp, military and intelligence expert of Germany, and our final speaker for today's conference is Colonel retired Alain Corvez, consultant in international affairs, former advisor to the French Ministry of the Interior. Welcome.
Merci pour votre invitation.
Thanks for your invitation.
Je parle en français.
I will speak in French.
Je veux dire que j'ai entendu plein de discours très sensés, très
very sensible and reasonable speeches so far
de cette conférence déjà.
at this conference.
J'en ai entendu d'autre part.
I have heard otherwise.
J'échange avec de nombreux experts dans le
I have in discussion with many experts all over the world. The conclusion is that these speeches are balanced, are not listened to. Why? Because we are in a situation of total nihilism. I want to quote as introduction, as preamble, a phrase of Nietzsche, part of his posthumous fragments. Nietzsche wrote towards the end of his life, what I'm saying is the story of the next 2 centuries. I describe what is coming, which cannot come in another way, which is the arrival of nihilism. Nietzsche is probably one of the big thinkers of the current century. I think he's badly known and badly interpreted by certain philosophers. It's a hard-hitting thinking.
Le gai savoir, quand il avait
his
dit,
writing the aphorism 125 of the madman, in the middle of the day, he went out with a lamp saying, "Where is God? Where is God? I'm looking for God." After a very interesting development, and then he said, God is dead, we killed him, and we will have to pay for it. We will have to pay for this awful murder we committed. Now I want to go, of course, further, but he saw that nihilism was arriving, taking over, and if I insist on this philosophical aspect of my speech, because we are in a period of total nihilism. The President Putin President Xi Jinping are proposing, developing in a calm way, very reasonable proposals. And in the West, we have people who are complete, which are demented. In the West, we have demented who go out with a lamp in the middle of the day to look for things which don't exist any longer. Today, it is impossible to establish diplomatic relations between East and West because the West is demented, completely demented. This has to be taken into account. Only very powerful forces will be able to turn the tide. We're assisting today at the end of U.S. hegemonism in the world, especially in the Western world. It's while this hegemony is still very strong in Canada, in Australia, Japan, all these nations are following the directives of Washington. Since the end of the Second World War, Washington has put into place an infrastructure and a logistics which system with money, with media control. They are dominating the Western hemisphere, even if some intellectuals are speaking up to denounce this unacceptable situation. But we're assisting at the end of U.S. hegemony in a tragical period where people die. There's huge suffering from humanity because the United States, for interior political reasons, are plunging in a big crisis, and their foreign policy is disastrous, and the new world brought by China and Russia and other countries which are joining this, like Iran, and the Western powers don't want to accept this. They don't want to recognize. They don't want a reasonable strategic rethinking. So the potential crisis with many people killed in Ukraine, in Palestine, this is happening because there is the refusal to recognize that they lost the global dominance. This will happen till the next U.S. election, and this situation has provoked hundreds of thousands of deaths. That is nihilism. We're also in the denial of rational thought. They cannot imagine that there can be a superior force to their own forces. But that is happening, and that they, at one point, they will be obliged to accept it. The United States will remain a major power in world affairs, but not necessarily dictating everything on the entire world. The Schiller Institute is promoting, of course, is a more balanced international situation. Time has come to respect the nation states. Helga Zepp-LaRouche spoke about the Treaty of Westphalia. It was in 1648. Was a clear call to respect the sovereign nation state, their own culture and history. We have to revive the spirit of the Westphalian Treaty, where the interest and respect of others has to be taken into account, and that this should be balanced between their interest and our own interest. Western leaders have become demented, like this demented person described by Nietzsche. We are in this world up till the U.S. elections of November. We cannot, the U.S. is not available for a reasonable discourse. There are major forces pushing to keep the conflict going in Ukraine. And I disagree with Helga Zepp-LaRouche when she says that Russia is keeping up its military front. What I think is that Russia is perfectly able to really go completely ahead with a full military offensive. But Russia has no intent of doing this. Russia does not want to bomb civilians in Ukraine. It of course, unfortunately, inevitably happens in such type of conflict. But Russia could immediately go to Odessa, but Russia refuses to do that. Maybe at one point they will arrive at Odessa. It's not any longer the Ukrainian army who's in war with Russia, but it are the military advisors of NATO, which are Polish, Canadian, American, Dutch, French, of all the nations. These experts are deploying the NATO weaponry on Ukrainian soil and have the training to do so. So it's NATO. This is a war of NATO against Russia. While pretending in speeches, Biden, of Macron, Stoltenberg, saying, "Well, no, we don't want a war with Russia." They say this all day long, but it is not. Today, it is the NATO forces which are deploying NATO weaponry with NATO intelligence and are hitting Russian territory with sophisticated weaponry. So we have. It's worse than hypocrisy. It's completely incoherent. I don't want to confiscate more time, but I want to insist on the fact that there is also an economic aspect to this. The Russian economy is developing, and the European economies, especially Germany and France, are collapsing. It would be rational that Western Europe cooperates with Eastern Europe and Russia and Asia. Russia is, of course, taking the energy resources which would be vital for the Western economy. The former global power of the U.S. would have the interest of seeing a united Europe with Eastern Europe and Russia. I want to finish with the Israeli-Palestine conflict, because these both conflicts cannot be separated. These are the two symptoms of a former all-powerful USA, which is using the Palestinians and the Ukrainians to hide to the world that it's for its own end game. And the end of its the Israeli war cabinet, which is a clear example of dementia. These people are not any longer in rational thinking, they've lost the war. The war with their so-called war against Hamas, they have reinforced. Now the world knows everything about how they are losing influence. I just want to quote an article of the Jerusalem Post of June 9, Jerusalem Post. There's an Israeli general, retired, Itzhak Brick, says this war cabinet
les citoyens israéliens, car il mène l'État d'Israël dans les abysses. Et il va plus loin.
Rejected by the Israeli population because it leads us to the abyss. This fight against the Palestinians, we have known.
La majorité du
enlightened part of the world is now rallied in support of Palestine and against us. We still have the support of the U.S. government, but for how long? This general is intelligent, but the Israeli war cabinet is completely destroying the Israelis' influence in the world. I want to conclude. We have to bring back to reason our governments, including the French government, and the people should rise and to stop the war drive, which is destroying our economies in the vain hope that the survival of the American hegemony will survive, which is clearly lost. I thank you again to give the opportunity to speak up here today.
Well, thank you very much also, Colonel Corvez. We're going to now bring up the entire panel to participate now in a question and answer and discussion. And let me make sure that they're up okay. And I believe we have, of course, Helga's there, Ambassador Freeman, Professor Toloraya, Dr. Lazorkina, Lieutenant Colonel Bosshard, and Mr. Rupp and Colonel Corvez. All right. Well, first, I'd like to just ask Helga if there's something that you might have to say, and I think I'll just also say to the entire panel, we're going to just ask any comments that any of you have on the speeches of one another. Following that, we'll open up for the questions, and I think the first person I will be calling on, just to know, is Mr. Vitaly Romanovsky of Belarus. But Helga, if there's anything you'd like to say at this point.
Well, I'm very happy about the presentations because, I think the crisis is so existential to all of humanity that I think it needs the required concerted efforts of all the best, well-meaning people from many countries to solve this. And therefore, I really want to express my appreciation to all the speakers. My question is, in my mind, the most mind-boggling question is, okay, people have egos, they have a sense of identity, which is in an overblown sense of identity, and they cannot, penetrate their thoughts to reality. But what is happening with the collective establishments of the West, or the establishments of the collective West in each country, is so absolutely unbelievable. Just in the recent European election, we saw that there is a complete rejection, or not complete, but very far-reaching rejection by the people of the governments. Macron is at an absolute low point. I think the NATO people are completely in a frenzy about what will happen in the election in 2 weeks from now. because, you know, NATO may not last. I mean, that's an option. Then naturally, the German government got a complete slap into the face, and similar in other governments. And why is it that not there are some people who have the greatness of the establishment to say, okay, you know, we are the reason, our policies are the reasons why we have such a blowback worldwide. Our reputation is at a low. I mean, I traveled a lot in countries many years ago where Germany had a very high standing. People had still the idea of Beethoven, Schiller, great scientists, inventors. And now Germany has become the laughing stock. They cannot defend their own interest. You know, we have a chancellor who stands by when Biden tells him that they will take care of the Nord Stream pipelines, and he doesn't even say a word. And, you know, Germany is clearly doing a policy which is against the interest of its own people. So my question to all of you is, you know, what is your explanation of why this is so persistent, and what can we do to shake it up? Or is it true what Garland Nixon said yesterday in the IPC discussion? Forget the elites, forget the establishments, get the people on the street. That's the only way out. So that's my question to all of you.
Okay. Is there anybody on the panel?
Is there anybody on the panel that would take that?
I think we got some distortion there. Let me repeat. Is anybody on the panel like to answer or have thoughts about what Helga just asked? Okay. Mr. Rupp. Go ahead. I think you may have to unmute. Let me see.
Can you hear me?
Now we can hear you. Yes.
Okay. All right. Now, I asked this very same question to a retired former deputy, well, in American language, it would be Assistant Secretary of Defense of Germany, now of the Christian Democrats. I mean, he actually lived also through these Wintex exercises, and at one moment he actually stopped it. I asked him. He was very active in his party, and he was well known. He is still well known nowadays. And I asked him this question: why? Who in the Christian Democratic Party, in leading position, would be able to get us out of this mess? And he said, no one, no one. They are all firmly in the hand of the U.S. deep state. I asked, well, do you mean? Well, he said, look here, remember, what it was it? God, age is calling. It's true. Remember the American program back in 2000, in the year 2000, when the EU called a big investigation, and because the U.S. NSA used its assets all over Europe, but also in Germany, to listen in on all telephone calls, all private calls, etc., of politicians, businessmen, etc., etc. Echelon. That's the name of the program. Echelon. So 20 years later, they didn't even shy back from listening to and monitoring the private telephone of the Chancellor Merkel. And so imagine they all got them by well, as Nixon said, by the balls. If someone steps out of the line, he won't, or he or she won't stay on board or in their position much longer. We had two presidents who actually went down very fast when they said the wrong words. What was it? My God. The one was a deputy deputy CEO of the International Monetary Fund, and he was made president of Germany. And when the financial crisis started, 2007, 2008, he actually, when the whole state was mobilizing to save the banks and the big capital, he actually called the financial system and said they have created a monster which is threatening to devour us. That was his kind of attitude, and he actually said that too. And not much later, he resigned. Why? One still doesn't know until today, but they probably found something. There was the French Minister of Finance and the German Minister of Finance, Oscar Lafontaine. The French Minister of Finance's name now I cannot, doesn't come back in a moment, but you all probably remember him. He and Oscar Lafontaine, they were taking some measures, or wanted to take some measures, to reduce the influence of the dollar in Europe. And well, as it happens, the French Minister of Finance, on his way back from a visit to the IMF in New York, was arrested by the New York police because apparently he did an unlawful offer to a cleaning lady who was doing his room. You remember this, the thing?
Strauss-Kahn. It was Dominique Strauss-Kahn.
Yeah, Strauss-Kahn. That was his name. Now he gone, and Oscar Lafontaine, as a Minister of Finance, also resigned from all his positions, not only from his position as a Minister of Finance, but all his party positions. Explanations never given. So they obviously must have shown him the instruments, whoever they is, but they must have shown him the instruments, and they've decided, well, we better step down. I mean, we can go through more and more and more things like that. I mean, they're just some things that come to my mind now. And I think this is an essential element, while at the same time, if you stay on board and do as you are told, and involve yourself in this transatlantic elite and participate in it, which President Bush Sr., he created this kind of thing, which he called in 1990-91, in a number of speeches, the New World Order. The New World Order, in which the elites of all member countries work together. They are, and we won't have any more frictions of nationalism will disappear, but everybody, the elites, all they will profit from this, etc., etc. If you don't participate in it, you risk of being marginalized and disappeared or cancelled in the AUKUS. That is my try to explain it.
Okay. Anyone else have anything they'd like to add? Or, okay, Colonel Bosshard? Yes, could you unmute? Hold on, I'm not hearing you yet. Still can't. Up.
Should be working now?
Yes.
Great. Well, what Helga Zepp-LaRouche just said is an aspect of the political crisis that we are in the West in general, and that comes from the fact that we have created a very particular political atmosphere, or maybe rather a political fashion. You know, our cabinets our governments are now populated by young, good-looking boys and girls right out of the offices of public relations agencies. I usually call them young, good-looking, and useless. And if you look at the pictures taken at the end of various summits, and you can, the next one will be taken in Switzerland on the Birkenstock conference, you can see these boys and girls. So I don't think I have to add a lot more on that. And we are now in a situation in the West that we must start to understand that although we might be the most powerful nations on earth, we're probably not the smartest ones. And a combination of being rich and not being smart is a terrible combination. We are permanently underestimating others and overestimating ourselves. So the key to a change would be to abandon our arrogance. We must understand that the new great American century that many have been dreaming of after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the so-called Warsaw Pact is over, and we have to start to behave accordingly. And the quicker we understand that, the quicker the bloodshed can be stopped in Ukraine and elsewhere.
Okay, very good. I have, I just want to announce, I have questions for Ambassador Freeman and for Mr. Rupp and also for Professor Toloraya and for Helga. There are several questions, but I just wanted those people to know. I know there may be some constraints for schedule and so on, and just wanted to make sure to pre-announce that. And I think if there's no other direct response to Helga on that matter, I'll go to Mr. Vitaly Romanovsky of Belarus, who I think has a particular question that he wanted to, or a statement he wanted to make. So if we can go to him.
Dear colleagues, distinguished guests, do you hear me? Am I
Yes.
heard well?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to deliver a short comment and ask a question to the distinguished speakers. So my comment and question refers both to the Belarusian position and the history of the Belarusian positioning in the European security architecture, that we are still, the contours of which we are still having right now, and we see how it is, but unfortunately we see how it is transforming, but not in the way that we can control or even guide. Belarus has a long history of peace initiatives in the East European region and altogether in the European security architecture formulas. I could refer, for example, the peace negotiations that took place in 2015 regarding the wave of crisis in Ukraine. Then, after the start of the special military operations, I could remind that the first negotiations between the Ukrainian and the Russian delegations ahead of the Istanbul took place on the Belarusian territory. In view of that, in view of what was already delivered by the distinguished speakers, I could remind one more initiative that has been voiced by the Belarusian leadership since 2017, when Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko first initiated the idea at the international level to have a new peace process, a new peace formula negotiations regarding the European security architecture that is called Helsinki II. my question to the guests and the speakers would be, in view of what has been voiced today, do you see any preconditions right now to return to the broader negotiation process regarding the European security architecture? And if it is, when could potentially take place? Thank you very much.
Okay. Any comment? Okay, if I'm missing you, please just raise your hand. Clearly, I'm having a little bit of a... Okay, Helga?
Well, I think that, obviously the present governments are not so far inclined to enter such a discussion process. This is why I have suggested that we should find ways to organize different settings. Like, for example, if one would organize an international conference of think tanks from all 5 continents who would engage in such a discussion. I have proposed these 10 principles. This is not to say that that's all which should be discussed, but just as a way to, start off the discussion and to, name those areas which, as a minimum, must be dealt with if you want to have a new security and development architecture. So that would be one approach, to just say, let's have 10, 20 think tanks from around the world to actually discuss, maybe like a mock Peace of Westphalia 2, which would then be a guidance and an inspiration for the governments to follow. Or it could be done on the level of different universities. Anything which, right now, it's not just that, unfortunately, I have to agree with Mr. Rupp about, the way how politicians who don't stay within the line are being gotten rid of. That is the case, but with it goes a complete lack of dialogue. If you have reached a situation where you are not completely in line with the NATO narrative, you are being put on lists, which kill lists. You are being ostracized. You're being called a Putin agent. And I have already said many times, it's an insult to my intelligence to say that I'm anybody's agent, because I'm proud to be a self-thinking person, and I have a long political career or life. So I have accumulated a certain amount of judgment, which may be sometimes right, sometimes wrong, but I claim that I do have this judgment. And, there is right now in Europe probably in the United States, it's better because the United States is the hegemon, and there the citizens are allowed to be a little bit more free than in the colonies. And Europe has become a colony to a very, very large extent. So you have no free dialogue anymore. You have no intellectual debates. You have no discussion about what are the fundamental issues of war and peace, of culture, of science. And I think that any such dialogue among universities or think tanks or other fora would be a step in this direction.
All right. Anyone else? Okay. Professor Toloraya, yes.
Yeah, I would like to follow up for Helga's suggestion that I've mentioned that the new idea emanating from Moscow has the not strictly European, but Eurasian security mechanism, bilateral, multilateral Eurasian security mechanism, and also the absence of non-regional military troops in the region, that means U.S. troops. So this is one of the ideas which can be discussed with the Eurasian countries on a broader basis, and the idea of think tanks from different countries starting a track to discussion of this issue could be helpful.
Okay. Actually, we'll stay with you for a minute, Professor Toloraya, because it was a question, if I can get it here. Yes, this was from Luis Ortega to you. What is your opinion, Professor, about the fact that the United Nations yesterday approved the condemnation of coercive measures and blockades against people and sovereign countries? No effective measures taken against the United States, which is the one that does it and is the protagonist in the world. This is he's referring to this law not being applied to Israel or Zelensky in Ukraine. So I don't know the exact measure he's referring to, but if you are aware of this, Professor, he's asking a comment from you about this.
I'm not sure. Maybe the idea of sanctions was discussed at the United Nations.
Yeah.
Unilateral measures, which are, well, to call it non-diplomatic measures, this is just the act of war, act of non-violent war. And it's used discriminately by those countries who hold economic power and who has the keys to the dollar system, mainly by United States. And this is just another powerful weapon. I remember a book called Paper Soldiers about U.S. dollars. So this is clearly the war method used by United States and other dominant powers against their opponents without any international community approval or United Nations decision. So I think this is simply illegal.
Okay. There's a question sort of for the panel as a whole from Germany, from Elka Zvinga. And she says, am I right to see both Ukraine and Israel as the same imperialistic forces as USA and NATO? She says, the only way to get out of the present circumstance seems to be a peaceful politics based on the United Nations Charter. Around the world, there are peace organizations. These also exist in the West. Is there anything that they can do further to advance this cause of moving to a multipolar world? So that's her generic question. Anybody have anything to say?
So
okay. Well, no one wants to take that question at the moment? Okay, there is a... Okay. I'm sorry, I didn't see you. Go ahead.
No, I said that the best way, what the IPC, the International Peace Coalition, is trying to do is to indeed unite all peace movements of the world under the slogan, if you want, world citizens of all countries unite, because the threat of thermonuclear war on a global scale makes every citizen automatically a world citizen. So I think you should help us in the outreach, get us in contact with these people, and let's just try to unite, because I'm absolutely convinced that the vast majority of people, not governments, but people, want peace. They're the victims of war in any case. So I think we have to find a way of uniting our efforts even more quickly and more stronger than we have been doing so.
Okay. And I'm not missing anybody else. I'm having a little bit of a problem on my screen, but okay. Let me go to the nation of Zambia from the continent of Africa. This question is again to the panel, although I don't think Ambassador Freeman is with us right now, but the comment is about the Joe Biden ceasefire proposal for Israel, Gaza. And what is it actually? Is it actually a unique proposal? Is it a good proposal? There seems to be a game being played, and this is asked from Munasha from Zambia. Anybody have a comment about that? Professor Toloraya, do you have your hand up? Oh, not. Okay, no. Okay. Okay. Helga, go ahead.
Go ahead.
If nobody else wants to answer, I can only say that one has the fear that it may be a game because, you know, it is up to the United States to implement this and make it work by, obviously, they have the power to convince the Israeli government to comply or not. And if they're not putting their force behind it, then the question mark is how serious it is. However, having said that, I personally think that the only way it can work is if we put the OASIS plan on the table, and that would mean that neighboring governments from the Gulf states, from Syria, from Iraq, from Iran, Turkey, just every country of the region should really step in and propose the implementation of the OASIS plan, which is the idea to create much large amounts of fresh water through desalination of ocean water, through the floatable nuclear reactors which could be put along the coastline. You can bring in the idea of building canals. You can have all kinds of methods of creating new fresh water and engage in a serious industrialization and infrastructure program for all of Southwest Asia. Because I only think that if you inject a vision of hope for all the people, especially the young people in Israel, in Gaza, in other parts of Palestine, in all the countries of the world, of the region, because, look at Syria. Syria is still devastated. Yemen is still devastated. Iraq, likewise. Afghanistan, likewise. So what you need is really the spirit of the Belt and Road Initiative as an infrastructure industrial development program. We had one very important conference on this OASIS plan, which you can find on the site of the Schiller Institute, but it does require governments to step in because this is so big, it cannot be done on private initiative. So that is, I think, what will really change the situation.
Okay, here's a question that we're going to direct particularly to Colonel Corvez or others that may have a comment. It says, how do you assess Marine Le Pen and her attitude toward Vladimir Putin? On the one hand, she does not want to send French ground troops to Ukraine, but on the other hand, I have heard that she prefers to shake hands with Putin. What should we actually make of this? What is the truth here? So it's a generic question, but also they'd like to have an answer from someone from France. I think you may have to unmute if you're trying to speak.
I'm sorry. Who asked this question? And can you repeat shortly?
Yeah, the question is from Gerald Strickner. And the question is, how do you assess the person, Marine Le Pen, and her actual attitude toward Vladimir Putin? On the one hand, she does not want to send French ground troops to Ukraine, but the other, it sounds like the person basically is a little anti-Putin. I can't quite tell. She prefers to shake hands with Putin. The question is, what is her attitude? What should we make of this? And it'd be good if she moved in a direction for peace. But what is the truth of what France is doing and what her party is doing?
Okay, I got it. I don't trust Marine Le Pen. I think I am very happy that her party had a sort of victory to the French elections, but it was mainly a vote by many French citizens against Macron. And it was not an addition to the philosophy and ideology of the Rassemblement National. But anyway, I don't trust Marine Le Pen because she has been behaving differently and she has been changing the line of her political views. to become an acceptable party. And then she has been moving from pro-Russian position to a European position, joining the European position regarding Russia. Then I think if she was in power, she will not send troops to Russia. But, you know, she is a politician, and that's a problem in France. We were in chaos with Macron, and we are going in more and more chaos. But the politicians are now fighting to try to find their way through this chaos. But they are not honest, and they are not clear on their future policy. And I think for the Rassemblement National and Marine Le Pen, she will change his position according to the fact, not in the interest of France, only in the interest to stay in power. And that's a fact that there is no politician leader in France, except some, for example, Mariani, who used to be a minister in France and who is part of the Rassemblement National. He is a friend of Russia, and he made clear declaration in favor to stop the war in Ukraine and so. But she is behaving between this position to be European acceptable for other European countries, and in a position to show that she will not send troops to Ukraine to fight on. But you know, I think we have to be very, very careful about the declarations in a political period of new elections in France, because people are not saying the truth, but they are saying what they think the voters want to hear. Then that's why I think the main objective should be to put Macron in difficulty, and then to unify all the political forces in France, which are again Macron. But it is a very difficult aim.
Okay. Any further comment? Okay, I have a next question is going to be for both Helga and for Professor Toloraya. And this is from New York, from Kynan. And he is asking this question. In the extraordinary meeting that occurred in St. Petersburg, President Putin had remarks on the Bretton Woods system, and he responded to the president of Zimbabwe regarding investment in African nations. He said, and this is quoting Putin, "We need instruments that would guarantee investments and return on investment. What can this be based on if not on gold? On the quality of the proposed investment projects. If we ensure the quality and stability of political regimes, and we have to do this together, then we can develop such a system of settlements which will be practically devoid of volatility, will not be volatile, will not be subject to inflation. All this can be done." Can Professor Toloraya comment on the significance of these remarks, particularly as to how this may relate to the construction of a new financial architecture for the nations of the world?
I would say that, of course, there are many factors that determine the investment and the guarantees of investment, and there are general international laws and national laws and regulations. Also, there is always a place for some calamities or some unforeseen circumstances. But it is true that the issue of financial architecture is now in the center of attention, especially of BRICS. And BRICS is trying to create new rules and regulations, very detailed and very wide set, that would probably, I have no information on this, but probably it would address the issue of investment and investment guarantees and investment protection, among other things. This would, of course, include the African nations, because there are now several African nations in BRICS and more to follow. And I think that President Putin mentioned that, knowing about these plans.
Okay. Helga, any comment on that?
Yeah, I think a lot of things are happening in this respect. For example, it was reported that Sergei Glaziev met extensively with Dilma Rousseff on the sidelines of the St. Petersburg summit, and the increase of the function of the new development bank was obviously discussed, and also more technical discussion about how you can create a new trade currency, how you can eventually even create a reserve currency, and many formulations. And people who have studied what my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, has been writing about it, will have noticed that a lot of the formulations and concepts really resonate with some of his papers. Like, for example, he wrote a famous paper about trade without currency, where he discusses how, productivity of an economy, and including the raw materials, different raw materials, would be the measurement for setting the value. And these are concepts which are completely outside of statistics, outside of GDP, but they refer to the principles of physical economy. And it is very heartwarming to see that there is a far-reaching discussion about these issues going on. And that makes me actually confident that it really can put the large part of the world economy on a much more sound basis. So that's my observation.
Okay, and there's another question sort of in the same vein, which I'm going to bring up now because it relates to topically. And it's a question for Helga, but anybody can answer. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is now going to sell its oil in multiple currencies. To what extent is this a natural move away from the U.S. dollar dependency? And to what extent can this be perceived as an action against Western hegemony? How can any of the BRICS countries continue to develop and work with each other without being perceived as an act of war against the U.S. and NATO countries? Okay, Mr. Rupp.
I can't remember exactly the year, but I think it's almost 70 years ago that there was an agreement between Washington and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, saying that you only sell your oil in dollars, and we provide protection against internal and external enemies of the feudal house. Now, that created, in fact, the basis for the so-called, or it was a nucleus for the so-called petrodollar, because as Saudi Arabia was the biggest oil producer in the Gulf, and probably at the time internationally, or traded internationally, the biggest exporter of oil and oil product, of oil, it was setting the price of the other producers in dollars. So, in fact, the key element of the key one of the key elements of the world's energy provider, meaning oil, was sold in dollars, which means a lot more dollars would have to flood the world markets. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been enough dollars around, which was also very convenient for the Americans, because in order to buy oil, all they had to do was print dollars. They print some papers, make it green, and buy millions of gallons of oil. I mean, that's the best of both worlds you can have. And as a result, as I said, it was the nucleus of the petrodollar, and with the petrodollar, subsequently the Vietnam War was co-financed by Europe. I mean, Europe accumulated during that period almost 600 billion US dollars coming, which as reserves, so-called petrodollars. And so all America the United States had to do is print paper. And therefore, to get now out of this, I mean, it's not just Saudi Arabia getting out of the dollar. It's not just Saudi Arabia getting out of the dollar. It means that the surrounding nations will lose the price setting in dollars. So they will also try to adjust to the kind of things Saudi Arabia is doing. And a lot of the countries are doing it already. So basically, it is in terms of financial warfare, the United States has lost a very, very, very important battle.
Okay. Any other comments on that one? Yeah, Professor Toloraya, did you have your hand up? I can't quite tell.
Yes.
Please go.
I want to comment on this, that of course US is very much suspicious of BRICS activities, but the tendency for decreasing of dollar in internal inter-BRICS settlements is obvious, and it's natural. And it cannot be other way if, for example, US prohibits Moscow currency exchange to trade in dollars, then it obviously leads to the decrease of dollar settlements in Russia, and it's in its cooperation with other countries. For example, with China, 90% of oil and gas deliveries are being settled in rubles and yuan. So there are no dollars. There's just 10% dollar in these exchanges currently. And so this tendency will continue. Same with India. We have some problem with rupees, of course, but anyway, the dollar amount and dollar share decreases, and Saudi Arabia just follows the trend.
All right. I think one final question we'll take, because we're sort of coming up on time, and I know some people have scheduling problems as well. This is for Dr. Olga Lazorkina. And this question says, I'm going to have to just read it here. President Lukashenko of Belarus has played an extremely vital role in the development of a multipolar order, guaranteeing the security of other nations. Belarus currently retains observer status in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and is also a member of the Eurasian Economic Union, and it has applied for BRICS membership. How would Belarus's participation in these organizations contribute to shape this new security and development architecture?
Thank you for the question. Республика Беларусь последовательно принимает участие в деятельности всех региональных организаций, те, которые были названы.
The Republic of Belarus consistently takes part in all the organizations that have been named.
И нашей целью видится повышение роли средних и малых стран, прежде всего.
Our objective is to increase the role of the small and medium nations, small and medium states.
После завершения Второй мировой войны мы жили в повестке великих держав.
After the end of the World War II, we lived in the agenda of the great powers.
Средние и малые страны во многом даже считали своим долгом следовать за теми нитями, той повесткой, которая была заявлена.
Small and medium states even had kind of an obligation to follow the agenda of the great powers.
Но сегодня мы видим, что повестка не просто выдохлась, она ведет сугубо к эскалации.
But today we see that the agenda has not the great powers agenda has not already almost exhausted itself, but leads to escalation.
Великие державы не справляются с управлением.
Great powers do not manage the control.
Поэтому средние и малые страны должны расширить зону своей ответственности.
That is why small and medium states have to increase the zone of its responsibility.
Кроме того, в нашем регионе конкретно
moreover, in our region,
мы наблюдаем разделение средних и малых стран на два лагеря.
We see the division of these small and medium states into two camps.
Государства, такие как Беларусь, которые являются сугубо ответственными,
states such as Belarus, who position themselves as responsible states,
и государства, которые проявляют очень высокую долю безответственности.
And the states who express a significant portion of irresponsible behavior.
Итогом их деятельности в нашем регионе является нарастающая милитаризация и эскалация как следствие.
The consequences of the behavior of such states from the second category is the increased militarization and escalation in the region.
Поэтому Республика Беларусь занимает самую активную позицию в структурах, таких как ШОС, БРИКС, Евразийский экономический союз, союзное государство, Организация Объединенных Наций.
That is why the Republic of Belarus takes the most active part in such organizations as Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Eurasian Economic Union, BRICS, Union States, and United Nations, the United Nations.
После объявления независимости мы поставили себе ряд внешнеполитических задач.
After the declaration of our independence, we put forward in front of ourselves a few foreign policy objectives.
Сегодня в своем выступлении я говорила о миссии Беларуси.
Today I spoke about the mission of Belarus.
Донести до всех нашу точку зрения.
To deliver to everybody our point of view, our vision.
Относительно того, в каком направлении должно двигаться международное развитие.
Regarding the further way of development for the international community.
Мы предлагаем мировому сообществу на указанных площадках образ будущего.
During the discussions within the mentioned organizations, we suggest the image of the future of the world's community development.
Конечно, мы не находимся в отрыве от того, что происходит.
Of course, we do understand and are aware of the trends that are taking place right now.
Но те процессы, которые мы запустили внутри нашего государства,
but the processes that we initiated within the borders of our state,
позволяют нам говорить о будущем, общем будущем для всех.
Allow us to speak about the common future for all.
Thank you very much. Yes, very good. Very good. So we're going to take a few final remarks. Several people have had to go. We want to thank Colonel Corvez, Mr. Rupp, and also Ambassador Freeman, who have all, I believe, left. And I want to go to Lieutenant Colonel Bosshard and ask him for any final comments or observations he'd like to make at this point.
With pleasure, of course. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, great. I think we have to understand that we are now in a much broader conflict than just the conflict in and around Ukraine and Gaza. We are in a conflict between what Western leaders call the rules-based order versus the UN Charter. And as a consequence of this conflict, we created an atmosphere in which the readiness to negotiate is interpreted as a sign of weakness. I could observe that myself in the 6 years I served in the OSCE premises in Vienna. And along with this goes a lack of respect for everybody who could serve as a kind of bridge builder between the blocks. And the way that these potential bridge builders are being treated tells a lot about the political will for peace. And if I look at recent developments, particularly in the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, I come to the conclusion that particularly on the Western side, there's not enough will of peace. And that brings me to the question that Helga Zepp-LaRouche has raised, which is what can we do, what can the public do, particularly in the West, to correct the situation that we are in? And I think we should know less and know more, but demand, not only ask for or call for, demand leading politicians in the West to respect the order that was created in San Francisco in 1945 and to abandon plans to replace this order by a Western dictated rules-based order that is not being accepted anyway in large parts of the world. And President Putin just mentioned it yesterday when he was talking about conditions for peace in Ukraine. And most people probably didn't listen to that part of his speech. He was talking about a new security architecture. And I think not only Russia, but as well China, they will require the particularly West to accept the principle of non-intervention in internal affairs and to integrate it into a new security architecture, probably not only for Europe, but for the whole world as well. So the task ahead of us is to correct the long developments that started with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact in 1991. We have had wrong developments in the past 30 years, and we have little time left to correct that now, as we are on the brink, really on the brink of a nuclear war, that the West is drawing in the entire world, and this is, of course, not acceptable, and that must be said clearly, particularly to those gathering today at the so-called peace conference in Switzerland.
Thank you. Dr. Olga Lazorkina, any final thoughts?
Уважаемые коллеги, спасибо за приглашение и за возможность высказать точку зрения Республики Беларусь на региональные и глобальные проблемы.
Dear colleagues, thank you very much for the opportunity to express the thoughts of the Republic Belarus, of the Belarusian leading think tank on the regional and global agenda.
Мы полагаем, что сегодня крайне важно продолжать вести диалог. Если не диалог, то хотя бы разговор друг с другом.
We see it of utmost importance to continue a dialogue or at least a conversation with each other.
Нет более разумного и взвешенного сообщества сегодня в мире, нежели научное и экспертное. Я имею в виду фабрики мысли, аналитические центры и в целом ученые.
There is no more reasonable community than academia, think tank and expert community in the world.
Я говорила о том, что нужно усиливать, расширять роль средних и малых стран.
I spoke about the need to widen the role of the small and medium states.
Ну, очевидно, что и научное экспертное сообщество также должно на себя взять большую ответственность.
But it is obvious that experts and scientific community should take more responsibility.
Спасибо за внимание.
Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Professor Toloraya, final thoughts.
Thank you for this extraordinary opportunity to share the views on a very crucial moment. I think that's just the start of the discussion of different scholars and think tanks and civil society on the very topical issue, and I wish all the participants new success. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So, Helga, anything that you'd like to say now in closing?
Yes, I think what is needed is that everybody should really have a vision for oneself, for yourself. Because I have found that, as long as you just follow some prescription or some rule or some whatever, it does not function. You have to have an idea, what do you want to make with your life, which is obviously limited and mortal. And, if you look at the world today, if I think like in what position young people in the world are, it's not fair to them to leave them a mess like the present world. We have an existential crisis of humanity. It is not just the war danger. The war is just the outcome of a much more deep civilizational crisis in the West, for sure, which is reflected in many, many aspects. So I think it's important that not to despair and not to give into cultural pessimism, which I think is a mental disease and not something to be tolerated. It is important that everybody has a vision for yourself of how do you want the world to look like when you are gone for decades. What do you want the future to be, and what can you do with your life to make it a better world? We have suggested since the very beginning, since the Schiller Institute was created, to have a dialogue of cultures where each nation and each civilization would bring forward the best tradition, the best period, the high period of their own history, and then have a dialogue among the cultures and among the civilizations. And then hopefully a new renaissance will come out of that. And I think this is going on to a very far extent already among the BRICS countries, among the Asian countries. And I would just encourage that we do not give up the perspective that we are now in the most dangerous period probably of history ever. I would say the next 3, 4, 5, 6 months, if we get through that, we have a chance to reach a different plane. but the next period will be extremely dangerous. And hopefully we can create a dialogue where, you know, the best of all of humanity will be mobilized in this process, because I think nothing less is required. And therefore, I would ask all of you to join with the Schiller Institute and with the IPC, the International Peace Coalition, to, you know, get us through this period and hopefully into a better period of history.
Okay, thank you. Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Bosshard, Professor Georgy Toloraya, Dr. Olga Lazorkina, our colleague Vitaly Romanevsky, and Helga Zepp-LaRouche. I want to thank you all for being with us. Also, we want to extend thanks to Ambassador Chaz Freeman, Dr. Caroline Galactéros, Mr. Rupp, and everyone else that was able, and also Colonel Alain Corvez. Didn't want to forget him. We want to also thank all of you that have been with us and participating for our panel, the first panel here of our conference. We will be resuming our conference in approximately an hour with panel 2. See you then.